Larry Bird is widely known as one of the greatest players of all time. He was incredibly clutch, had one of the highest basketball IQs the game has ever seen, and won 3 championships alongside 3 MVPs. But there's one thing people often overlook. Larry Bird loved to showboat, from literally telling opponents when and where he was going to shoot, to complaining that teams had white guys guarding him, and even playing an entire game with his left hand because he was bored. Bird always made sure you knew when he was cooking you.
He was cooking everybody, but talking shit and telling them about it.
But how did Larry Bird become this good in the first place? And how did someone who seemed like the complete opposite of an NBA superstar become one of the greatest players the game has ever seen? Well, to find that out, let's dive straight into his second season in the league. April 26th, 1981, the Boston Celtics, thanks to their 1980 Rookie of the Year, Larry Bird, leading the franchise to the largest single-season turnaround during his initial season in the league, decided to bolster their roster with big man Robert Parrish and rookie Kevin McHale over the offseason. Moves made to ensure that this time around, Boston, who entered this playoff series against the Philadelphia 76ers as the championship favorites, would actually get past their Eastern Conference rival. Only the final buzzer of Game 4 would indicate a tragic fact that the historic 14-time title-winning franchise, a squad led by a sophomore who was named to his second All-Star squad, made a member of the All-NBA first team, and came second in MVP voting, was just one loss away from yet again being eliminated by Philadelphia. Therefore, Larry Bird, a native of French Lick, Indiana, knew exactly what he had to do. Game 5.
He wants to go back and play in Philadelphia on Friday night.
Bird, after initially quitting basketball in college and becoming a garbage man back home, before returning to Indiana State and ultimately failing to earn a national championship at the hands of the Irvin Magic Johnson-led Michigan State Spartans, was desperate to earn his first major title. However, not even an insane 30-point night could guarantee that, as with just 55 seconds remaining, Boston, down 3, was on the brink of elimination.
Going to the hoop, Bird, he could not be denied. Larry Bird brings the Celtics to win 1 point.
But thanks to Larry's clutch layup and his teammate ML Carr placing his Celtics side up by a single point, this final defensive stop indicated a Boston Game 5 victory. Combine this with the fact that Bird on the Sixers home floor had recorded an insane 16 rebounds and 25 points throughout Game 6, saw Boston shockingly force Philadelphia into a final deciding battle. Game 7, win or go home.
Here comes Bird out of the pack. 1:05 to go. Larry Bird pulls up, and the Celtics lead.
Yet, despite the French Lick natives' heroic efforts, with this occurring shortly after,
33 seconds and a steal by Cheeks. A 3-on-1 break. Bo Cheeks goes up and draws the foul. Bo Cheeks is fouled with 29 seconds to play, and he can tie it up if he's all right.
his rival seemed as if they would be the squad heading into the NBA Finals. However, with Philly guard Maurice Cheeks only knocking down just one of his 2 free throws, somehow, some way, Boston, by just a total of 5 points combined across their final 3 games, had completed the unbelievable 3-1 comeback and were now preparing to face off against the only team to ever make it to the NBA Finals with a negative win-loss record, the Houston Rockets. But despite what Boston legend and current team president Red Auerbach witnessing what he called the greatest shot he has ever seen happening,
Larry Bird follows his own shot. Oh, what a play!
With the Rockets down just 1 point towards the end of this initial battle, it started to seem as if Houston's Cinderella run would be ending with a crown.
7 seconds on the shot clock. Parrish with 5. Larry Bird with a rebound.
Was it physical? Bird again.
A shocking putback coupled with the vital defensive stop which Boston recorded on the following possession, which saw the historic franchise earning a 1-0 finals lead. However, as the last buzzer rang out in Game 4, due to the fact that the Celtics sophomore star had struggled, scoring a combined 16 points in Games 3 and 4, even though Larry had provided valuable rebounding and playmaking, the NBA Finals was tied at 2 games apiece. A fact that left many to wonder perhaps that 7-game 76ers series had taken too much from Boston. Game 5.
I want to show you a quote by Moses Malone. Moses Malone said, "They ain't that good. I could get 4 guys off the street of Petersburg and beat this basketball team."
Bird, fired up by the comments his rival had made, came out tonight ready to show how wrong Moses Malone truly was, doing so by pulling down 12 rebounds, throwing 8 assists, and scoring 12 points, which, when combined with fellow Celtic Cedric Maxwell dropping 28 points and 15 rebounds, it was now Boston heading into Texas just 1 win away from raising their 15th championship banner. To make things even better for Larry, with his Boston side ending the Game 6 third quarter up by 15 points, it appeared as if the historic franchise was just 12 minutes away from bolstering their already loaded trophy cabinet. Only Houston, desperate to prove everyone wrong, began an insane comeback.
Off to Calvin Garrett. It's a 6-point game.
Going on a 13-0 run, which only saw the Rocket crowd becoming rowdier and rowdier. Therefore, Larry Bird knew exactly what he had to do.
Larry Bird, and he's going to hit those pressure shots now. 88-83, 4 left. Larry Bird again. Oh, as he hits some pressure-packed shots.
Bird, who had developed his game on a dirt court in French Lick, would rally his squad to hold firmly onto the lead they had built, finishing this game with 27 points, 13 rebounds, and his first NBA championship.
And when we won in 81, I thought we were going to win 5 or 6 in a row.
But what would happen next, nobody expected. May 23rd, 1982.
Boston Dark, 76th consecutive sellout.
Boston, after yet again finding themselves down 3-1 against the Sixers, is on the brink of completing back-to-back improbable comebacks here tonight thanks to Larry Legend's insane play.
Larry Bird is not the leading scorer of this series for Boston, but he's leading him in just about every other category.
Yet, even with a balanced Boston approach, Bird, Parrish, and McHale all scoring at least 20, Philadelphia's Andrew Toney was simply unstoppable. The 76er guard would come out and not only earn an epic nickname, the Boston Strangler, but score 34 points, a total that saw Philadelphia sending the defending champions back home empty-handed. However, this wasn't the only tragic failure for Bird and his Boston Celtics, as throughout the 1982-1983 season, even though Larry was beginning to develop insane confidence,
I go shake his hand, and he put both hands behind his back. And I'm saying, okay, he's getting his head ready to play. First play of the game, he says, "I don't know where they got you guarding me, Holmes." And he shoots a 3. I was pissed. I said, I wasn't mad he hit the 3. But there's some bitch that's called me Holmes. Because I remember one time I came down and I dunked it on him. He laying on the ground, he fouled me, and I'm pointing. And he said, "Hey, Rook." I said, "What?" He said, "I like you. You got, he said, you got balls, but I'm still going to get 30 on your ass." He got about 38.
The Celtics, despite Bird's major improvements and epic regular season play,
we have a play, out of bounds play, I'm taking it out, and Larry says, "I'm going to bust off the play, and I'm just going to come out, and I'm going to shoot a 3, and I'm like, "We're down 2. I'm like, "No, don't do that." I'm like, "Let's shoot a 2, please. Go to the hole, try to get fouled. Let's just get into overtime, see if we can't win this game." And Larry says, "No, I'm just going to bust a 3 on him." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh." So he tells the Phoenix bench, he tells the coaches, "Yeah, I'm just fixing to bust a 3 on you guys and just go home. I'm tired of this." And he gets the ball, jumps out, busts the play, comes out, gets the ball to slot.
Loops it to Bird, a runner. It's good! It's good!
Shoots the ball. As the ball's in the air, he kind of turns towards the Phoenix bench and yells, "Told you so!" He starts running to the locker room.
After their round 1 playoff victory against the Atlanta Hawks saw serious issues begin to boil over. Because their main rival, the Philadelphia 76ers, over the offseason had added the same player Bird had dominated in the 1981 NBA Finals, Moses Malone. Therefore, the Celtics, noticing that they might not actually have enough firepower to take down Philly, decided to add a 16-point per game forward, Scott Wedman, mid-season. But due to the fact that Boston's roster was already loaded with talented role players, minutes for these athletes were hard to come by. Coupling this frustration from many of their non-stars with the fact that Boston's whole roster was beginning to become sick and tired of their head coach, Bill Fitch's drill sergeant style that sent constant criticism at everyone, the Celtics were struggling, starting their season 31-10 before rounding it out 25-16. And by the time they reached the second round of the Eastern Conference playoffs for a battle against the Milwaukee Bucks, Boston was ripping apart at the seams. A fact that saw the Celtics, for the first time in franchise history, being swept out of the postseason before they even met the Sixers, and Bird sharing this after the season. "This will linger in my mind for a long time, maybe the rest of my career. I'm gonna punish myself all summer for what happened in the series." However, even though they had one of the league's best players leading the way and were just 2 years removed from winning a championship, could the Celtics really get back to their winning ways? Or would these chemistry troubles prove too difficult to overcome? June 3rd, 1984.
Well, we just play like a bunch of women tonight. You know, we got some great players on this team, but we don't have the players with the heart sometimes that we need. And today, when you see Magic slapping high fives and guys going behind their back and shooting layups on us all day long, it seems that somebody would try to put a stop to it. And until we get our hearts where they belong, we're in trouble.
Boston, after returning all the way to the NBA Finals for the second time in 4 seasons, has just suffered its worst playoff defeat in franchise history, and were now faced with the fact that they were not only down 2-1, but Game 4 was to be played in LA. So how did we even get here anyway? Well, after living up to his post-elimination promise,
When you get your, quote, superstar to work at a high level in practice, everybody else falls in line because this is the man, and he will work. And Larry worked every day.
I put my time in, so I knew I put more time in than anybody else. And I had skills that other people didn't have, so I had a lot of confidence in whatever I did out there on the basketball court.
and continuing his showboating ways,
We're in Los Angeles, and I got a pulled hamstring. So I'm not playing tonight. He walks down to me. Man, I'm sorry you're not playing. But he said, I'm going to tell you what. Since you're here, I'm going to put a show on for you. So you just sit back and watch, okay?
He'll look at you like, hey, what you doing out here? You ready to call somebody else? I even heard him tell the coach, hey, look, coach, you better get somebody else out here to guard me because I'm killing this guy.
He was cooking everybody, but talking shit and telling them about it.
Boston had been dominating. However, it wasn't really Bird who had led this turnaround. No, because the Celtics had opted, after Bill Fitch resigned, to promote former guard Casey Jones into their head coaching role. Combine their hiring of a former player who led through trust and rarely ever raised his voice, with the rebalancing of their roster through some offseason moves, Boston had returned to their recent glory, as thanks to Bird dropping an insane 39 points, 12 rebounds, and 10 assists in their must-win Game 7 against the New York Knicks in Round 2, and then avenging their failure at the hands of Milwaukee last season with a 4-1 Eastern Conference Finals victory, Larry had set himself up for a rematch against his former collegiate rival, Magic Johnson.
Playing against Magic, yeah, that was something that I always dreamed about since he beat us in college.
Yet, facing the reality of potentially being in a hole no team in NBA history had ever escaped from in Game 4, Larry Bird understood exactly what was required of him.
The whole series changed that day.
Game 4.
Bird fights Kareem, slings the elbow, and now is Gillian and Larry Bird. Jaw to jaw. And they better pull him apart.
The Celtics, desperate for banner number 15 and rallying behind Bird's cry, were now less than a minute away from tying the series at 2 games apiece. Only they still had to score another bucket to break the 123-point tie that existed between LA and themselves.
Casey drawn up the play for coming out of the huddle, and Larry turned and said, you guys want to win the game? Just give me the ball to get out of the way.
Cooper all over him. He can't do a thing. Bird turnaround, hits. With 16 seconds to go, and the Lakers call their last, although they have one more, they call a timeout. 3 seconds to go, and the Boston Celtics have evened this NBA World Championship Series at 2 games apiece.
But what happened in Game 5 was even crazier. Because back home at Boston Garden, the ancient arena lacked air conditioning, and with Massachusetts suffering from a heat wave that day, temperatures inside the Celtics home court were reaching near 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet, when asked pre-game about the heat, Bird said this.
Oh hell, it's hotter back home playing in French Lick.
Larry Legend, in this pivotal Game 5, would come out and dominate so hard that the man responsible for defending him, Michael Cooper, would dub Bird a 10-dimensional player.
Larry could shoot the three, he could go off the dribble, he could rebound, he could get offensive rebound. He was a tremendous passer.
Larry Bird. You ever seen many players who could shoot off balance as a forward like Larry Bird can?
Larry's 34-point and 17-rebound Game 5 performance had placed his franchise now just 1 victory away from his 2nd NBA championship. However, the Lakers, hungry for their own title, came out and repeated Boston's dominant home floor performance and sent this series into the deciding final battle. Game 7.
Well, I thought we'd sweep him in 4, but this went a little bit longer. Now we just have to do it in 7.
Hayes from Bird. Lakers had several chances, and here's Larry Bird chugging down the court. First pass. Bird. How does he do it?
I don't know.
To Rambis. Blocked out of bounds by Larry Bird.
A matchup that, thanks to an all-around effort from the full Boston Celtics roster, 20 from Bird, 22 from Dennis Johnson, and 24 from Maxwell, saw the Celtics earning their 15th championship banner and Larry Legend winning his first ever Finals MVP.
At that time, I always thought that Magic, and still do, thought he was the greatest player I ever played against. And I knew he'd be back. And I knew he'd come back strong.
So, could he really defend his crown? Or would Boston falter yet again like they had in 1982? January 27th, 1985.
He was a cold-blooded killer. In the last 24 seconds, he would demand the basketball.
Fall away. Hits it at the buzzer! All right! All right, here's Dennis. Gets it into Bird. Larry, a runner. Got it! Ball game's over. Boston wins.
Yet, if you thought that was insane, the now 2-time champion would do something even more shocking on February 18th. Because upon exiting the game in the 3rd quarter, Bird was just a single steal away from recording a quadruple double. Yet Larry never returned. But why?
Numbers don't mean nothing. The win was more important. Getting a quadruple double meant nothing to me. I mean, really, you go into a game and when you're up by 25, 30 points, just for a steal, makes no sense to me. I did enough damage already.
However, that was nothing compared to what occurred on March 12th when Boston faced off against the Atlanta Hawks.
When a guy is literally coming up the court, calling his shots, and he literally says, left side, over across the 3, and you're listening to him, that's a tough feeling.
Bird on the drive, the runner is good again. You're seeing a greater performance as you'll ever see from Larry Bird.
Because with limited time left and in desperate need of a basket to win this battle, Bird did this.
He literally said, off the glass into the trainer.
15 seconds, he got fouled. He hit the shot. They're not going to count it. And Bird falls into Joe O'Toole. Bird has 60 points.
Shocking performances that simply continued on deep into the 1985 postseason. Initially moving past the Cleveland Cavaliers in round 1 thanks to 34.7 point and 10.7 rebound averages before destroying the Detroit Pistons in round 2.
We walk out on the court and he said, "Who guarding me?" And I was like, I got Kelly, I got Lamb, I got Benson. He's like, "You ain't got no brothers?" He's like you. He's like you.
Disrespecting me.
That's what he said.
Straight up.
That's exactly what he said. He said, "Hey man, you can't put no white dude on me."
Hey,
that is straight disrespect, right?
With Bird scoring 42 in Game 2 and then 43 in Game 5 before demolishing his rivals in the Eastern Conference Finals.
He was cursing under his breath. And I asked him, I said, "Larry, what's going on with you?" He says, "You guys are being disrespectful to me." And I says, "What are you talking about?" He says, "You guys are putting a white guy on me." That's disrespectful.
Setting up a rematch of last year's championship round. So, could Boston do the impossible and become the first franchise to repeat as champions in almost 2 decades? Or would Bird's rival avenge their failure from 1984? June 5th, 1985. The Boston Celtics, in almost the same fashion as last season, are down 2 points heading into the 4th quarter of Game 4, and a defeat here would place the 15-time championship-winning franchise down 3 games to 1.
I like to play a strong 4th quarter. If I play a strong 4th quarter and we're close, I feel that we're going to win the game.
Larry Bird outside.
He's getting that mean look on his face. Loves the 4th quarter.
Inside Parrott. Bird fights, basket counts and a foul. Bird. 26 for Larry Bird. 12 here in this 4th period.
But with the game still knotted and 19 seconds remaining on the clock, Boston required a miracle if they were to leave the Forum having tied the series.
Bird, double. Dennis Johnson, 2 seconds. It's good, the game is over.
However, despite Larry Bird dropping a 16-point second half in Game 5, it was the Lakers heading to Boston for Game 6 and maybe 7 with the opportunity to do something no other franchise in the history of the league had ever done.
Everything is back there to be had. History, the Boston Garden, retired numbers, world championship banners. We have a chance to do something that no other team has ever done. Go back to Boston Garden and win a world championship on that parquet floor.
Something that, while the now 2-time MVP would provide as much resistance as he possibly could, scoring 28 points and pulling down 10 rebounds, would devastatingly happen, crushing Larry Bird. Yet, there was only one thing the French Lick native could do about it. February 8th, 1986. Thanks to the flurry of new fans due to the popularity of the Bird/Boston vs Magic/LA rivalry, the NBA would add a brand new event to its All-Star Weekend, the 3-point contest, and Bird, upon entering the locker room before heading out on court for the inaugural challenge, asked his rivals one simple question.
Who's coming in second? You already know who's going to win this.
Something that Larry backed up by scoring 22 points in the final round and being crowned as the NBA's first ever 3-point champion. However, it's what he did 6 days after this that might have been the most hilariously disrespectful thing the current 2-time champion did in his whole career.
Larry would go into a creative mode a lot of times just because, he did get a little bored. So he scored the first 8 points of the game left-handed, and Jerome Kersey was guarding him at the time, and I remember this because we had a great trash-talking team. I mean, we had ML Carr, we had McHale, we had Bird, we had, Ainge was a yacker. I mean, we had guys with great creativity with that, and I'll never forget it. McHale yells out, "Hey, Jerome, wait till you start shooting right-handed."
Scoring 47 points against the Portland Trail Blazers, and while it wasn't entirely left-handed, the fact that the only reason Bird switched back to a right hand was to win the game is just insane. But Larry Bird wasn't done cooking the league. Whether it was trying to set scoring records, talking trash in game, or psyching out his opponents during shoot-around,
When we practice, he would be running around Boston Garden while we was practicing.
Bird's insane play throughout the 1985-1986 season had led Boston to hold a 40-1 record at home and preparing for another ascent to the NBA mountaintop, a climb that they began with the dismantling of the Michael Jordan-led Chicago Bulls, which, despite Jordan's best efforts, Bird's near 30-point average saw them advancing before embarrassing the Atlanta Hawks again in round 2, and then steamrolling the Milwaukee Bucks throughout the Eastern Conference Finals,
Larry Bird dives for a loose ball and gets it to McHale,
resulting in Boston returning once again to the NBA Finals for a matchup against their 1981 rivals, the Houston Rockets. So, could Boston repeat their initial championship success against Houston, or would their revamped roster, led by their 1984 #1 pick, versatile center Akeem Olajuwon, and his front court 7'3" running mate Ralph Sampson, avenge that loss? Game 6.
When I stepped on the court that night, there's no question in my mind that if we're going to lose that basketball game, it's going to be because I lost it.
The Boston Celtics, after an insane playoff run to this point, which saw them just a single win away from their third crown of the 80s, stepped onto the iconic Boston Garden parquet floor and simply continued on with what had gotten them there in the first place.
When you've got a bird out there, the other four guys know if you just move and get in the right place, that's your only responsibility. You know that ball's going to be there. It's beautiful.
The thrill and the beauty of the Celtics playing was the ball moving from one side of the floor to the other side, 3 or 4 crisp passes, and an easy shot resulting from that.
But as usual, once the buzzer indicated the beginning of the game's final quarter, the Celtics looked to one person and one person only.
Okay, Larry, it's time to take over.
2 seconds on the shot clock. Bird wants a 3 out of it, and he gets it.
Seeing their now 3-time MVP scoring 29 points, throwing 12 assists, and pulling down 11 rebounds, resulting in Boston earning their 16th championship banner, Bird his second Finals MVP, and Larry himself describing Game 6 of the 1986 Finals as the greatest game he had ever played, and that he should have just retired at this point. However, now a 3-time champion, 2-time Finals MVP, and 3-time MVP, there was just one thing Bird had to tick off: repeating as NBA champions. May 26th, 1987.
Seasting right in his face. Thomas with a very big bucket, and Boston uses their last timeout. Detroit with 1 remaining. And it's Detroit by 1, 17 seconds, so Boston goes for the final shot.
Larry Legend, after yet another season filled with his signature showboating.
And during the timeout, I'm going to a play, and I thought, this is what we're going to run. All right, then as you get the ball, you go over here, and pass to Kevin, then you go to the corner, and Robert, you come over. Then about that time, Larry steps in and says, Coach, why don't you just give me the ball and tell everybody to get out of the way?
They called a timeout. He said, you know I'm going to get it. I said, I know, I'm going to be waiting. And he said, I'm going to get it right here. I'm going to shoot it right in your face.
5, and Bird has the basketball. Look out. 2 seconds on the clock, and timeout used by the Sonics.
And, he was like, I didn't mean to leave 2 seconds on the clock. I fall back to the sideline like, damn.
Has just 17 seconds here to correct the course of the Eastern Conference Finals back in their direction, because right now Boston is mere seconds away from being slapped heading into Game 6 with a 3-2 deficit against the rising Detroit Pistons.
There's Bird with the ball against Mahone.
He'll take it to the hoop. You can bet. He's going to try to draw a foul.
It's blocked. And Seasting hit it off of a Detroit player. No, it is. Here's a disparity in the call. They're going to give the ball to Detroit. Bird steals it. Johnson, layup, Boston, 1 second left. Detroit timeout. Bird is on Lane Beard. McHale waving those long arms. Lane Beard out of bounds. Boston will win this game.
An insane steal that,
in my opinion, the greatest single play that Larry ever made.
Saw the Celtics, even though the pesky Pistons saved their season in Game 6, ultimately advancing into their 4th NBA Finals in a row. This time set to play the Los Angeles Lakers.
Anytime you play against the Lakers, you get this type of feeling where, you feel like you got to win. You got to win. I don't care if they win one game out of 4 or 5 or 7. You still got to win. You got to beat them because the Celtics have always defeated them.
So, could they finally become the first franchise to repeat as champions in 18 years? Or would it be LA dethroning the current kings of the NBA? Game 4.
Kareem does it, and the Lakers jumping for joy, and they lead it 104-103.
The Boston Celtics, after faltering on the road throughout the 1986-1987 regular season, conceded the finals home court advantage to LA, resulting in the Lakers heading into Boston Garden for Game 3 up 2-0. And even though Larry Bird's 30-point and 12-rebound night had breathed life into Boston's repeat hopes, with just 30 seconds left here tonight, it might just be the Lakers grabbing that 3-1 advantage. Or would it be?
Bird goes for 3, and the Lakers call time with 12 seconds left.
But despite the usual Larry heroics, LA still had 12 seconds to correct their 2-point deficit.
Kareem is fouled with 8 seconds to go.
To make matters even worse for the Boston Celtics, due to Kareem missing his second free throw and the ball being tipped out of bounds by Kevin McHale, LA was gifted, now down just 1, the final possession to steal a Game 4 victory.
Magic with a hook shot, scores with 2. And the Celtics trail by 1 with 2 seconds to go. Bird fires it. And the Lakers have won in Pat Riley, and the Lakers dance off the court.
An insane game-winning hook shot that deflated the Boston Celtics. Because even though they had won Game 5 at home, the Lakers playing Game 6 and the potential series-deciding Game 7 on their own home floor ultimately entered their 6th battle fueled with confidence, resulting in LA for the second time in the 1980s defeating the Boston Celtics and crowning themselves as champions. A devastating fact that saw many questioning if Boston was even good enough to return to the finals, because out east, the Detroit Pistons were ultimately just a single game away from eliminating Boston. And even if the Celtics could handle the team nicknamed the Bad Boys, there was a certain Chicago Bulls shooting guard who was beginning his own ascent up the NBA pecking order. May 22nd, 1988, the Atlanta Hawks, despite initially going down 0-2, making this second round series appear as just a mere layover for the Boston Celtics on their route back to championship glory, the Hawks would mount their own insane comeback, winning games 3, 4, and then 5, placing themselves just a single win away from the Eastern Conference Finals. But with Bird, as usual, guiding his Celtics side to a Game 6 victory, he knew exactly what he needed to do tonight against the pesky Hawks.
He has promised his faithful a victory in number 7. He claims the Hawks blew their chance in number 6 when they lost at home in Atlanta.
But entering this must-win game's 4th quarter, Larry Legend had only scored just 14 points. And with the game tied, perhaps this series did truly belong to the Atlanta Hawks.
Tied at 88 with Bird again pulling up, putting Boston ahead. Bird attempting to break free, stays with it, and the foul is called. The continuation for Larry Bird. 5:50. Bird cuts free, left hands it for the field goal that puts Mason Jones and the Celtics back on top. top, 101-99.
Well, as usual, Bird was simply unstoppable.
20 points this quarter. He is 9 of 10 in this period. He has hit his last 6 field goals, and as far as Larry Bird is concerned, it's Detroit, here we come.
Dropping a shocking 20-point fourth quarter and pushing his Boston side back into the Eastern Conference Finals for a rematch against the Detroit Pistons. However, this time around, despite his usual trash talk,
y'all double me tonight when I get the ball in the wing? I said, nah, man, straight up. He goes, y'all ain't double teaming me?
Like, what's wrong with y'all?
Nah, I got you, dog. You don't like height. He goes, mouse in the house.
And you 6'11".
And they lifted. He walked me down to the post, got the ball. He said, you better ask for a double team, Sal.
Talking to you the whole time.
The Pistons were simply too formidable. Yet, this wasn't the only tragedy for Larry Bird in 1988. As just 6 games into the following 1988-1989 season, Larry, due to surgery on both of his heels to remove bone spurs, was ruled out for their entire campaign. And while Bird would return for Boston's 1989-90 season, his back began to become a serious issue. Because while Larry did continue his classic showboating,
remember Anthony Mason, just the kind of the point forward, power guy, just big, strong guy. He's sitting out there, man, that guy's like, he's got, muscles everywhere. So before the game, Larry looked at him, he goes, hey, Kevin. I said, yeah. He goes, look at this guy, man. And he's standing, he goes, look at all those muscles. And, Anthony Mason's just standing there kind of posing, and then Larry looks at him and goes, yeah, all those muscles aren't going to help you tonight. He said, I'm going to bust you up. And Larry would shoot the ball and yell muscles when he was shooting it.
Boston, after an insane 7-year run in which they had played in 5 NBA Finals, was ultimately done. Constant back problems kept their superstar at bay, and upon their elimination at the hands of the Cavaliers in 1992, Bird could no longer bear the pain, retiring as a 3-time champion, 2-time Finals MVP, 3-time MVP, and perhaps one of the most underrated superstars the game has ever seen.
Tonight I leave you and I say thank you. I'll be around, but tonight my basketball career is officially over, and I had a blast.
Speaking of showboating, did you know that there was another NBA legend who not only is perhaps the greatest modern showboater, but a player that some critics believed quite literally ruined basketball? To learn more about the incredible ways Steph Curry disrespects NBA teams, not only through his shocking play, but also his cold-blooded celebrations, click the video on your screen right now.